what happens in Indonesia, as well as, the other 6 countries, which includes the United States, of these 7 countries will matter significantly for the world, because that's where 50% of the population lives. And so therefore, I would argue Indonesia and the United States are 2 of the important countries in this, if we're going to really think about having significant opportunity in global policymaking. Here you can see that, I mentioned earlier, while the median age of the world is roughly 30, that disguises or obscures a lot of variation. And so here you can see at the country level where the different median ages are. Excuse me. And you can see that particularly sub-Saharan Africa, the median age is very low, large number of very young people in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and of course, Europe, Japan, Canada, the United States, kind of much older, but just recognizing that then the nature of the challenge of youth participation in policymaking is going to vary significantly based on how large or small the youth population is as a percentage of overall population. And that's a particular challenge in sub-Saharan Africa, clearly a challenge in Indonesia. As we look at the distribution of ages in Indonesia by broad age groups, you can see that, Indonesia as an overall absolute number has a relatively small population over 65 years. And if you think of between 15 and 24, roughly 100 million people, if you're thinking about under 24. If you look at the United States has a much larger, older population in absolute numbers and percentages, and a much larger 25 to 64 group, and relatively smaller as a proportion amongst the youth. And if we just compare Nigeria, which is one of the other 7 countries that we saw earlier on the map, as the most populous country in sub-Saharan Africa, you can see a very big difference right here. The percentage of the population that is under 24 is much larger than either Indonesia or the United States. And so challenges in a country like Indonesia to have youth involved in policymaking would be significantly different. This data comes from a study from UNICEF called the Changing Childhood Project, which did surveys of people in all of these countries asking questions about childhood. But we'll just look at it for the age distribution. So, excuse me, again, if we look at that kind of critical 15 to 24-year-old youth group, Indonesia has 17%. The United States has about 13%, so not that different. The big difference, of course, as we saw in the earlier, is the percentage of older folks in the population. But you can see there's a number of other countries where the largest percent of this population is under 14 years old. This is a particular economic, political, social challenge. Middle-income countries like Indonesia, face a slightly different challenge. But this just gives us a sense of, that there are not all, that the challenge of youth participation in policymaking is not going to look the same. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation in all countries. So let's look at some global and political contexts. So in general, if we think about the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a significant amount of democratic backsliding in terms of, excuse me, in terms of countries. The chart that's here comes from the varieties of democracy report that comes out every year. And their most recent report argues that the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2021 is back to where it is in 1989. So the last 30 years of democratization that basically occurred from the end of the Cold War have been destroyed, have been eradicated. Autocracies or dictatorships are on the rise, and basically 70% of the world's population, 5.4 billion people, live under authoritarian regimes. And excuse me, the other major question for issues around youth participation and so forth is that polarization in countries and the threatening of freedom of expression in countries is increasing in the last 10 years. So all of that, I would suggest, is a particular challenge for folks who are interested in advocating for greater youth participation in policymaking. Other survey data indicates that globally, particularly among the youth, there's a crisis of legitimacy of political institutions in general and political parties as well, and that much of the youth do not find themselves represented in kind of conventional, traditional political parties. We'll talk a little bit about this more in a second, but the general underrepresentation of youth in politics as a proportion of countries' populations. There's, of course, concerns about employment and job creation. There's, of course, the existential challenges around a climate crisis, and of course, the pandemic and its legacies, even though the youth were not the primary victims of the pandemic directly in terms of people who died, the impact on education and families and so forth. And for those children who did get COVID, for where their children and youth who who got COVID, and there seems to be an association with long COVID, which is going to be a long-term impact. So all of these contexts really bring a sense of urgency to the question that I would argue many countries have not effectively responded to in terms of how do we really create opportunities and have a forceful agenda around increasing an increasing sense of urgency around youth participation of youth in union. And if we look globally, we see that basically of the 192 chambers of parliament, and these are the lower houses of government in countries that have a bicameral or two houses of a legislature. So of the 192 chambers that report data, basically just over 2.5% of those parliamentarians are under 30. And even if you add for people who are under 40, that's still only 20% of parliamentarians. And basically almost a third of parliamentarians are under 45. But you can see much of that is really comes from the over 30 and 40 crowd. So parliamentarians generally relatively old, and then you can see the distribution by region. And Europe, despite Europe being one of the oldest regions in terms of the distribution, the median age of Europe, if you think back to that chart, Europe actually has the largest percentage. It's still inadequate, but has the largest percentage of parliamentarians. Excuse me, Asia and the Pacific have the smallest percentage of parliamentarians under 30. And that's, I think, particularly troubling. And we can certainly talk in the discussion, and I'll make some additional comments, but clearly the underrepresentation of youth in political systems, this is not just, democratic systems, any systems that report their phenomenon. A survey that was done in 2017, pre-pandemic, by the World Economic Forum, asked young people 15 to 24. This is a survey of about 24,000 respondents from 180 countries and territories. And you can see that basically 70% of the youth believe either strongly or somewhat that young people's views are not taken into account in terms of decision making. And when you look at the factors that these people suggest are the most important factors contributing to youth empowerment, you can see that none of them are really about political institutions. So the dominant ones are either, about availability of access to entrepreneurship opportunities, or about media, all of which are good, on that, other than ensuring that people have access to the internet. And that if you look at the justice system or transparency in governance or opportunities in politics, they're roughly about half the percentage of these other indicators. So people are not seeing the political system as providing significant opportunities, that to most extent it's the media. And so that's, hopeful and promising for thinking about the role that the media is going to play in this. But it is incredibly troubling to think that political institutions are not seen as viable vehicles for contributing to youth empowerment. That same survey also reports on this same group of people from 15 to 24-year-olds, whether they trust a range of institutions to be fair and honest. And the blue bars say that they agree, that they trust that those are honest. The green bars are neutral, and the orange bars are disagree. And you can see that political institutions do not do particularly well in this, with the exception of the judiciary, which is